Philadelphia is different, though, than the other cities that we've looked at on this channel. Going further east in the United States, we see that this city is something from a historical time frame, that it does seem to have the time frame that would make sense for the development of a city. And yet, most of the structures that we're going to be looking at were all built since 1800. So it's an interesting comparison that we're going to be looking at with what we've considered with other cities. Now, considering the fact that Philadelphia was at one time the capital of the United States before it was inexplicably removed to Washington, D.C., and yes, I say removed because that's the feeling that the historical narrative gives you, you have to wonder why the capital did not remain in Philadelphia. This is a beautiful city, and it makes all the sense for the capital of the United States to be in Philadelphia. This is where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Why did they move it? Why did the importance of this city change? And when we look at the structures in the city of Philadelphia that we're going to be looking at in this exploration, we have to wonder, especially when we look at the central structure of this exploration, the Philadelphia City Hall. Let's take a look at the history of the Philadelphia City Hall, and the source for this account is going to come from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Frequent viewers of the channel may have heard that I do have a very close collaborator who is an American civil engineer, a person who operated their own independent business successfully for several decades through a couple of recessions and great difficulties, and was always successful. Additionally, this is a person that's earned my personal trust, and I believe that should be the prime qualifier in if you're going to trust someone's collaboration, not simply their professional certifications. Not that I'm telling you to question professional certifications, that's your own decision. I'm merely sharing with you how I operate when it comes to research for the channel. So I believe that this account from the American Society of Civil Engineers lays it out very effectively what the agreed upon narrative for the Philadelphia City Hall is. Philadelphia City Hall was the world's tallest occupied structure and the nation's largest municipal government building when completed. Its load-bearing masonry construction is unique for a building of this size. Philadelphia City Hall was the largest masonry load-bearing wall building in the world at the time of its completion in 1901, stood as the tallest occupied building in the United States until 1909, and still is the largest city hall in the United States. An incredible feat given all of our modern architectural achievements. Of course, naysayers will tell you that we have so many regulations now and there's so many safety standards in place, we could never construct a building like this now. It's not because we lack the means, it's because there's regulation. Well, there's a great reason. The building covers 14.26 acres, originally contained 634 rooms with over 1 million square feet of space, and with its tower and statue of William Penn, rises a total of 548 feet above the ground. Here's where it gets really interesting. The construction of Philadelphia City Hall began in 1872 and was completed in 1901. So they give about a 30-year time frame, which seems credible, but there's more to it than that. The bill providing for the erection of a new city hall passed both branches of Pennsylvania state legislature in early April 1860, but it took them over a decade to get started. Okay, fine, bureaucratic delays and so forth. That makes sense. And the voters of Philadelphia selected Penn Square as the site of City Hall on October 11, 1870. Sounds very similar to the story or account that were given to many other amazing buildings. The building was designed in the Second Empire mode of French Renaissance Revival architectural style by architect John MacArthur Jr. with the assistance of Thomas U. Walter, John Ord, and W. Bledon Powell. Interesting there because has anybody ever seen a building in the First Empire mode of French Renaissance Revival architectural style? What about Third Empire mode? Or maybe Zero Empire mode? I wouldn't be surprised if there were buildings classified as that. I'm being a little facetious, and yet we come across all these different accounts and naming conventions. How exactly does it make any sense? Another interesting note is that two of the names of these architects, including the lead architect John MacArthur and John Ord, MacArthur and Ord are both very well-known historical names within the United States Army. Intriguing. Yes, my favorite adjective sometimes. The walls are brick, faced with white marble, and rise to a height of 337 feet above the ground. Not including the statue of William Penn, the tower rose 173 feet above the top of the building's masonry construction. The building measures 486 feet by 470 feet and rises 7 stories high. Of course, you need to have a 7-story building for your city hall. can't do it with 2, 3, or 4, could you? The 18-foot, 3-inch high basement story was constructed of white granite blocks that weigh from 2 to 5 tons and form walls up to 22 feet thick. There's no adjective that can really describe how unbelievable this is. The foundations of the tower rest on a bed of concrete 100 feet square and 8 feet 6 inches thick. The Tacony Iron and Metal Company hired civil engineer C.R. Carl Robert Grimm to design the upper wrought iron frame, metal-clad portion of the tower, which surmounted the masonry tower and supported the 37-foot-tall, 27-ton bronze statue of William Penn, which they lifted to the top of it, obviously, or so we're told. The tower was designed to carry its dead load along with live loads on 3 floors and the balcony of 100 pounds-feet in horizontal wind loads of 50 pounds per feet squared. The octagonal prism tower designed by C.R. Grimm consisted of wrought iron framework that supported the cast iron outer plates, which were electroplated with copper and then covered with a fresh coat of aluminum. The tower's pins and anchor bolts were steel. So that's the official engineering account of the Philadelphia City Hall. And what do you think of it so far? We're just not even going to say anything about this construction photo or the veracity of it, but I like how these statues are just hanging out there on their own as though there's nothing to support them. This construction photo doesn't even rate a construction photo. I'm not even sure what to make of this photo. Why don't you let me know in the comments? You like the phantom tower that we have there in the background? And what's with that pole there? What exactly is that for? And who knows, this photo does not even give the feeling of being real despite being from the City of Philadelphia's Department of Records. So I don't even know what to make of it. However, it's an interesting enigma that I thought I would share. And other construction photos. Isn't it intriguing how we never have construction photos of the foundation or construction of the interior of the building? And one of my benchmark buildings, and I think it's important that we have a benchmark building, for me and for this channel, it's the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, Iowa, because it's an unprecedented building that doesn't make sense. And here we see similar construction of the Philadelphia City Hall in Philadelphia with the scaffolding. Of course, you'll never see a single column or pillar being put into place. You'll see what appears to be cranes and scaffolding and a curious lack of individuals on the work site. And we have our usual plethora of excuses for why that's not in the photo. Despite the fact that years before this building was made, we had very wonderful photos of the Grand Army pass in review in Washington, D.C. at the end of the United States Civil War. As always, make your own judgments. However, looking at this scaffolding, do you really get the impression that they're building a building? Or does it look more like they're renovating it? And who knows what's the situation with the sky in the background, or how it seems as though we have connections that just disappear. Now, a photograph of the tower. And again, a photograph that raises more questions than it answers. And this is one of my issues when we're looking at photographs. And of course you're going to say, Aurelian, well, why do we use photographs? Because whether the photographs are fully genuine or altered, they still give the impression of a narrative that we're supposed to believe. You look at how precise the construction of the top of this tower is, and this matches many of the supposed construction photos that we have of many other capitals. And what's most interesting to me about the Philadelphia City Hall is that I think this building compares, if not exceeds, the greatest state capitals in the United States. But for me, the real story is when you look at the interior of the building. You can see that the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines is a stupendous building that's on top of a hill and directs all attention towards it. You can see the same thing with the Philadelphia City Hall. Found this little sketch interesting because this reminded me of the LeQueux sketches, a two-dimensional sketch from the side of the building. Because apparently that's all you need to design a building, just like that's all you need for a patent. You don't need any detailed information. Just do a little side diagram that's two-dimensional, because we don't live in a three-dimensional world, do we? No, Carl Sagan is not going to appear in this episode, okay? Right now, the Voyager probe is out of communication distance, so unfortunately he's not appearing. Then you see the ornate detail in all the statues, the carvings, or the prefabricated construction. Or really, how did they do this? How much time did it take to either fabricate or carve this, however you believe this was constructed, to say nothing of how it was lifted in place? And this has all been standing up there for well over 100 years. And when were these details actually constructed? 1870s, 1880s, 1890s? We have a wide time frame, although what I didn't mention is that, according to historical accounts, the building was already occupied in 1877, only a few short years after they began construction. And here you see another detail of what looks to be an eagle with a couple horses around it. I suppose we could say those are American symbols and represent the time frame that this supposedly occurred in its construction in the 19th century. And we see the usual surrounding columns that look like it's something out of Rome. Always the same story with these buildings. How exactly are these columns French Second Empire Renaissance? I have no idea, and I'm not going to try to speculate here. I do like this symbol, though. There's something very profound about it, and it conveys something that you tend not to see when you walk in the National Mall of Washington, D.C. I wonder if they were looking at this building as a potential Capitol building for the United States. Why do we have this contradiction in the story of Philadelphia being the capital, and then they decided to move it to Washington, D.C., a city that they constructed from nothing, supposedly because it was supposed to be the most centralized location in the United States at that time? Well, the United States grew very quickly, and with our ability, if we go off the historical narrative, to quickly pull cities out of nothing and establish these incredible buildings, why didn't we build a new capital further to the west that was more centrally located? Why didn't they make, say, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Chicago, or finally Omaha the capital of the United States? There's always a slew of explanations for why they did and didn't. Very telling photo as to just how tall the statue of William Penn is. And we recall its weight and height designations, and here you can really see its scale. And they supposedly lifted it to the top of the building, and we see a photo where it's not on the top of the building. I would love to see some photos of them actually lifting the statue to the top of the building. And while I wasn't able to find them in my initial explorations, granted I'm working on multiple projects, if anybody does have any photos of that, I would certainly love to see it, and please share them on the channel's official email, or on the comments, or on Reddit. See, this is all you really need, just a series of sketches, and this shows you how it all went down. I'm convinced. This is evidence enough for me. Just show me some sketches, and I believe it. They built the tower, they got the statue on top of it, because the sketches show it. Now, I'm being very facetious with this one. But why is it imperative to show sketches like this? Was this some sort of plan, or was it supposed to be some sort of documentation? Well, if it's documentation, then show us pictures. Like this picture where we look at the interior of this building. And it's here where I think we tell the real story, looking at the interior of these buildings. Because this defies simple explanation. The columns, the pillars, the arches, the ornate detail, the height of the ceilings, and last but not least, the floor. And you will never see a single construction photo, whether it's Philadelphia City Hall, the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, the State Capitol in Connecticut, or name a building. For some reason, they never decided to document any of this internal construction, the construction of the floor, the foundation. Well, tell us about it and give us some supposed details. Yet nobody wanted to take any photos of it. I think it would be a stupendous illustration of the abilities and the capabilities of the people of the 19th century, as we're told in our historical narrative, if they had some photos showing the erection of these incredible internal structures. Now think about it. Do you think a building like this could be built now? If we took all the resources, and let's just say we removed all these supposed regulatory requirements and all these safety requirements that allegedly prevent construction of a building like this now, do you really think we have the capability to construct something like this now? in 30 years? Or in 6 years, because that's all the time they said it took for them to start building the building and then occupying it, and the rest of the time was on the tower? That's where the narrative gets even more dicey, in my humble opinion. And just in this photo alone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 that we can see in the immediate photo of columns. Look at this. This is really a room in and of itself that defies explanation. It's almost like we're looking at King Arthur's round table here. And who knows? For all we know, we could be looking at some remnant of that time frame. Yes, it's probably going to far-fetched aspects, but who's to say it wasn't inspired? Because we have all these descriptions from our myth and our legends that we're told are myth or legends, and yet you can still walk in this building today. You can still see all of this today. This is not a building from a World's Fair that no longer exists, that we have questions about it. This is a building you can go to today, and you can verify for yourself, without photos, that all of this is real. All of this exists, and all of this stands today. And yes, supposedly, this building has a very colorful history, that our mainstream is telling us that there's lots of allegations of corruption, and that this building is an eyesore, and that numerous times they wanted to tear it down. And that even to this day, there are some people who want to tear it down. Isn't it always the same story with old world buildings, whether they're old manors, or city halls, or state capitals? Why would anybody want to tear this down? And there's even reports that to try to tear something like this down would bankrupt the city. Could anybody tear this down now? Look at these columns. Look at how large this is. So we always question, is it easier to destroy or create? This is something that defies explanation. And this is really an otherworldly building, and it's why I'm not going to use my usual adjectives to describe it. This is a building that is beyond everything that we've looked at. And this is something that in my mind is above the benchmark set by the Iowa State Capitol, looking at the interior. The detail and the effort in this amount of material. It's all still standing today. Of course they want to tear this down. It's right here in plain sight. And if you want to be one of those naysayers who say, well, this just looks like any other municipal building, that's very boring. Well, you really got to have some, let's just say, deep conditioning on your mind to not just be completely blown away when you see all of this. This is something out of a high fantasy movie, a science fiction movie. I mean, I'm reminded of many scenes from different great fantasy movies where they showed the interior of incredible palaces. I don't even know how you'd classify this building. I attempted to classify the Iowa State Capitol as a palace. Is this a palace? Or is this some sort of otherworldly building that shouldn't even have any kind of classification on it? Looking at the interior, I still try to visualize how they would have established this. Oh, and they also had a bathroom. And I know that's a bit of a joke about the bathroom with some of these older buildings, but they also had a nice bathroom. Although it looks like it's a little older, it does have some ornate detail to it. So just a little bit of a comical note to finish our discussion on the Philadelphia City Hall. Where would we be without some strange photos of construction going on in the street as though there's something underground? And you see what appears to be the railroad tracks, and we also see the surrounding buildings. You have to wonder what exactly is going on in here. Are they trying to show us something, that there's something underground? Are they renovating the street and doing it with some unique aspects that we don't fully understand? Well, it just wouldn't be an old 19th century photograph unless you had something strange like this going on. Again, we had unlimited means at that time. And it's interesting, I've gotten some feedback where some people have tried to tell me that it's disrespectful to suggest that these buildings and these achievements were not done by these people at this time. Well, somebody clearly built them, but I also think it's even more disrespectful to not ask questions and not to seek the exploration for how it was done. This is a 30th Street station, an internal transit station in our patented Art Deco building, built in 6 years from 1927 to 1933 and supposedly rebuilt in 1989. And as any typical Art Deco building, we see the very large ceiling, and of course it must have very large columns. Otherwise, it's not a true Art Deco building. Again, we have to ask the questions on this. How is this done, and why is this not done now? Weren't there more construction standards in place in the 1930s? And what about the Great Depression? All these incredible buildings always built the Great Depression. Here we have another example of what's supposedly Art Deco from that same location. And you'll see that it looks like every other Art Deco building that was built in that same time frame, except for the one in Kansas City, which was built before the Art Deco period, but still looks Art Deco. So I don't know what to tell you on that one. Is it disrespectful to not consider and compare historical accounts? What is being depicted here? And why does this not match what exactly was going on in the United States at that time? Now we go to the Fisher Fine Arts Library, a beautiful library built in 1890, probably within a year. And here we see the same details of very large and elaborate blocks and bricks and very solid construction. Again, I have to ask the question, is this something that we could do today with all of our modern means? Of course, we'll see examples of our modern means trying to renovate these buildings, or supposedly renovate these buildings. But when you look at a building like this and you see this kind of detail for what's supposedly just a fine arts building, this certainly goes well beyond the concepts of modesty. I'm reminded of other buildings that were supposedly built in this 1890 time frame. And here again, we have this unique architectural styling where we have this larger rotunda, and then it builds up into smaller series of floors above it. Why don't we build like this anymore? It's very beautiful and it's very alluring. I even like the windows right down there. Then you look at the doorway and the entrance, all these bricks and larger blocks and archways. It would be very interesting to see construction photos of just these archways alone, to say nothing of the floor and all the other detail that went into this. I even like the window. Once again, we see what appears to be inspired and imaginative design that vastly exceeds what we have available today. And the interior, almost giving stylings of something from a time far more glorious. It was just done in the 1890s, and to suggest otherwise is being insulting to the people who did it, and the architect who made it happen. I still wonder how everyone just happened to be wandering the country and they were also skilled in this extreme variety of architectural types that were given from 1860 to 1910. But don't ask questions, just accept it. This is the entrance to the Central Library, 1927, another supposed Art Deco building. And I include this just to compare and contrast it with what you just saw with the Fisher Fine Arts Library, supposedly built several decades before this one. Yet both of these buildings convey an opulence and some sort of methods that seem beyond our capabilities. You see it in the size, the height of the ceilings, the pillars and the columns. And on to the Philadelphia Stock Exchange, thrown up in 2 years from 1832 to 1834. Once again, I have to ask the question, and I've never really seen buildings like this. Could we build a building like this today? We're told it was built in 2 years from 1832 to 1834. Once again, with the columns, the pillars, the large windows, and the very large blocks with details within them. I even like the detail around the rotunda, both the inscription and then the pieces that seem to be added. 1832 to 1834, before the widespread use of photography. Even has a nice little tower on it, and you see more columns on the tower, and what's supposedly a wind direction finder on a weather vane. Yes, of course. What an incredible building to operate as a stock exchange or a mercantile exchange, as they tell us. And soon, this building will be 200 years old. This is the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, originally constructed in 1904. Supposedly it was renovated and reopened in the 1980s, and it's now facilitated by the Hyatt, and it's called the Hyatt at the Bellevue. and you can go stay there still today. And as you can see in these amazing, beautiful details in this building, we have the usual trappings of very large columns, very wonderfully constructed floors, and high ceilings. Now tell me, do you really think that any of the modern Holiday Inns or the Holiday Inn Expresses actually compare to this? And of course, I know people will be saying, well, because we build in brutalist architecture and it's cheaper and we need to have cheap hotel accommodations. Yes, let's discuss what's happened with hotels over the last 3 years. That's probably a topic for another video. Again, another beautiful, amazing, ornate building, and a place I think you would be delighted to stay in as a hotel that truly provides you luxury, something that hotels seem to have gotten away from, especially in the last 3 years. I wonder why that is. I just find these interiors to be one of the most telling aspects of all these buildings that we look at, and there's a reason why I focus on the interiors. This may not be the best picture, but when you look at the sheer beauty and opulence, you see a time long past. Now, people will argue that there's different reasons and causes for why this time long past seems far more luxurious. Now let's take a look at our patented castle for this exploration, Eastern State Penitentiary, designed, it doesn't say constructed, in 1829. I wonder if this penitentiary was designed in the 18th century or the 1700s, if it would be a gigantic star fort. However, we see the typical castle that is always ending up as either an armory, a prison, or, maybe it could be a library. Here's a sketch that shows the original design. Very interesting sketch that shows nothing else around it, and yet there's a very nice, well-developed road that runs right in front of it. Well, apparently this was based on the concept of what they considered individual confinement, but today we call it solitary confinement for rehabilitation. Starts that long, grand tradition of the prison system in the United States. It does have a castle appearance to it, and yet almost a barracks appearance to it. So if this was a building from a different civilization, what was its original function? We have to wonder. And yet just a random photo from Philadelphia showing us a street view. And the time frame on this is confusing. It says somewhere circa 1870s, 1880s. Who really knows on this particular photo? But I find that little clock tower up there to be an interesting aspect to it. And then here's something else that seems to stick out a little bit. Delaware Avenue Market House. And you see this interesting archway that seems very out of place. And again, we have the power lines, and we're looking at some conflicting accounts always tend to leave people to adhere to authority because authority has to provide them the answers. Conflicting accounts. For some reason, they don't want to search for answers on themselves. That's not all people, but it seems to be a lot of people. Here's the upper quad from the University of Pennsylvania. This was constructed in 1906, interestingly enough. And I have to wonder, what is it about something like this that compares with what we see in more modern university housing establishments, especially the ones made since the 1960s, where you just have these very large block-like buildings, many of which still stand today. Yet look at these wondrous towers with their spires, the beauty and the detail. 1906. I could see how a true student who was looking to learn and learning how to think and not what to think would be inspired. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, one of the most iconic buildings of Philadelphia. And why is that? Well, this was one of the ways that I was introduced to Philadelphia, watching the movie Rocky. During this exploration of Philadelphia, I realized that there is a lot more to cover in this city, and I'll definitely be returning to the city for further explorations. I wanted to look at some of the more iconic buildings and get an idea of what Philadelphia's story really was. The idea that I get is I can see why this was designated as our nation's capital. And whatever the true history is, you have a real old world feeling from Philadelphia. There's something very extraordinary about this city, and I almost consider it a tragedy that this isn't the United States capital right now. There's so much more to this city that seems to have a spirit and a depth to it, just looking at its buildings and its narrative. Now, of course, we question the narrative, and there's lots of contradictions, and we're not really sure what happened. A lot of people will just say that we should accept the historical narrative, and it's insulting to the people that built these buildings according to that historical narrative. There's nothing insulting about this, but there's something we have to accept. If we take the historical narrative at face value, in a society that we're told was inferior to ours and had inferior technology and an inferior society, and yet it was able to achieve more incredible feats of engineering that remain with us today, and all we're left with is excuses, then either way, that shows us that in the past we were truly more advanced, regardless of whether you believe alternative research or the historical narrative. Well, as always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.